Imagine that it is sometime in the 6th century BCE. You are a Greek merchant far from home, transporting your goods northeastward from the shores of the Mediterranean. The steppe is so much different than the scrubland and rocky mountains you are used to. Here, the vast landscape stretches in every direction, green and lush for the animals that pull the caravan. But you ventured away from your group, determined to follow a shortcut through the nearby hills. Then you hear it, the rumble of hooves against turf. You look up and see a band of mounted warriors cresting a nearby hill. Their galloping horses are far too fast for the plodding donkeys pulling your wagon, but fear grips your heart and you attempt to flee anyway. The thundering of hooves grow louder, and then you feel a stabbing pain in your back. Looking down, you see an arrow protruding from your side. Pain blossoms outward from the wound, and you stumble to your knees. The warriors are upon you now. A set of hooves come into sight, and you crane your neck to look up at your attacker. The horse is one of the finest you have ever seen, tall and powerful with a glistening coat. It is adorned in fine tack, and its rider sits on something you have heard of but never seen, a saddle. But what startles you the most is the rider's face. This warrior is, in fact, a woman. That's when you truly realize the gravity of your situation. You have come face to face with the Amazons of legend, a warrior race of women whose skill with the bow are only matched by their skill on horseback. The edges of your vision blacken, but you can hear the other riders circling you. The woman you can see takes a long-handled axe in her hand and draws nearer. The horse is practically stepping on you, and you can feel its hot breath. You look into the woman's eyes, searching for some kind of matronly kindness or girlish tenderness, but all you see are the eyes of a merciless warrior, burning with the fire of battle. Then you are swallowed by darkness as she brings the axe down upon you. Your death was brought about by a legend come to life. Welcome to History from Horseback.
I mean, if it was me, just saying, I would. I'm on my knees before that even happens. Just saying, I'm willingly and letting this happen. I'm here for it. Just saying.
Like, have you seen How to Train Your Dragon 2?
A very long time ago. Yes.
Oh, there's that one part that sticks in my mind is when forget her name, the girl twin.
It's not Astrid.
That
Oh, yeah, the
her,
twins, right?
yeah, it's like tough and rough, and I think she's
Yeah.
tough. Anyway, when she like has a crush on the guy, and he like shoots her with the net, and she's like, "Take me!" And she just like flings
Yeah,
herself
that's me.
into the net.
That's me. And somewhere my wife is standing off to the side, rolling her eyes, knowing that this is going to happen all along.
Hello, everyone. My name is Keegan.
My name is Keely.
And today's episode is not just about warrior women, it is about the Scythians. You know, this was a topic that I didn't know a ton about, and I learned a lot, and I thought it was very interesting and cool. So I hope you also find it interesting and cool.
I mean, women, horses, you can't really go much further for me, honestly. It's like basically my two big things of interest, so.
Like, every woman who loves women that I know loves Amazons, like that legend or whatever.
I think it's just like, it's like a simp thing, right? Like, there's a lot of people talk about, like, especially between, like, lesbians, like, the black cat lesbians pairing up with the Labrador lesbians. And, like, my wife and I are a really great example of that because she's absolutely a black cat and I'm absolutely, like, Labrador golden retriever sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And amongst those golden retrievers and Labradors, you get a lot of simps who are just there because it genuinely is just like my greatest joy in life to make my wife smile. And yeah, I mean, when you get like a buff woman or like someone like this who has some sort of authority, and it's just like, oh no, I would do anything for you. If you've seen any of the characters that I've made in any game that has a character creator, I have a type TM, and they are always the same sort of type.
That's great. Also, just like on a like serious note with like real people playing roller derby and stuff, some of my best friends that I made were all like very butch women.
Yeah.
And so I just have like a soft spot in my heart for butch women because I knew a lot of them and like there's a lot of misconceptions about them.
Yeah, I mean, like, as someone who like self-identifies as like very butch or very mask, you know, that on that sort of like train, it's like I think a lot of the times one thing that I really sort of like miss out in media is the fact that butchers don't get a lot of rep, and when they do, it's not very good, or it's very stereotypical, or it's very, you know, that sort of like white knighty behavior that's just like not necessarily, you know, it's one thing to love women and to love, you know, your partner or something like that. It's another thing to be like overly white knighty and just like picking a fight for the sake of it, like a lot of media likes to portray butchers, and it's just so frustrating sometimes. I think back to a lot of the media that I've watched, and like a lot of, you know, women loving women movies or TV shows, and it's like a lot of them are femme. A lot of them, like, I read a lot of books, like especially last year I read like every, basically, like, think of every big like lesbian romance book you could think of that's like been popular in the last few years. Like, I read all of them. And most of them were femme, or if they weren't, they were like, one of them was a bit more mask, but they weren't to the point of being butchy. And I think that was really upsetting because I was like, it sucks that you know, I think people have their heads stuck in this place of, you know, being either that relationships can only look a certain way, or that, you know, you sort of get criticized a lot if you're, you know, you come up on that question of just like, oh, you know, if you want to dress so badly like a man, like, why aren't you with one, sort of thing, like, or you know, why don't you just become blood? So many different things that like people just don't understand, and people will try and criticize you for, and it's just like,
or
why
like,
does it matter to you?
or it's like, oh, because you like dress and like a man, obviously you want to like emulate every single demeanor that they have, which like also isn't necessarily the case.
And it's like, no, in reality, a butch is the best of both worlds. It's the masculinity and the softness of a woman in one package. Like, it's literally the best thing ever. Like, I think it's also like, I think it's one of those things as well where I think people, you know, like, for a long time, like, it was really difficult for me to self-identify as a lesbian because lesbian was like one of those words that people had a lot of like, you know, feelings and thoughts about, and it felt like a very dirty word. And it took me a really long time to actually be comfortable with, you know, using it as a you know, as a descriptor for myself. But even more so with butch, because I think as soon as you say butch or mask, people immediately have like this idea in their head. And I will say, I have a shaved head right now. So playing into those stereotypes a little bit, but I don't think that should matter. Like, you know, I think people really box in what mask or butch sort of should or is. And I think people box it into a really narrow category and don't like pay attention to the bigger picture and the fact that like we're just living our lives, dude. We're just here existing, and you know, some people like it and some people don't. You know, it's not for everyone, but neither is, you know, the rest of the world.
I'm just so tired of in media seeing the butch be the protective ex, like overprotective, like bitchy ex. And it's like, ugh.
Or even worse, like, it's either the overprotective bitchy ex, or like the either the DV one, or like, you know, the one that it was awful and horrible to them, and you know that they don't talk about anymore.
Yeah,
exactly. It's just like,
yep.
Oh, it's so much. It's so much.
Yeah. Anyway, we love a good mask woman.
We do. We absolutely do.
This was the danger of me talking about like a hot warrior woman.
Genuinely,
in my
intro. Devastating. Yeah, my attention span was completely lost as soon as you said, was gone.
So, sources for today include The Horse, A Galloping History of Humanity by Timothy Winegard, And this is probably a source that I'm going to use quite a few times because it's like an extensive book on horses throughout history. It's like the perfect reference for this podcast. My next source that I referenced was Hoofbeats: How Horses Shaped Human History by William Taylor, which I've already referenced before in the Origins of the Modern Horse episode, so way back, the first episode we had. And then also the Introducing the Scythians article from the British Museum. Many of us are likely familiar with the stories of the Mongols or the Huns. These warriors terrorized the Eurasian steppes astride swift horses, utilizing expert bowmanship and ruthless military tactics. But they were not the first masters of the steppe. This title goes to the first true horseback riders, the Scythians. The Scythians were a group of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes that lived in what is called the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which stretches across modern-day Eastern Europe to Central Asia. Their culture rose to power roughly from the 9th to 8th century BCE and eventually died out around 200 BCE. They made their debut to notoriety by taking down the Assyrians, a civilization that had dominated the region at the time, until slowly crumbling from military defeats that picked apart their land. What made Scythians so unique at the time, and likely the reason behind their prowess in battle, was the fact that they rode horses. To offer some perspective, horses had been domesticated by humans for a while at this point in history. If you listen to our Origins of the Modern Horse episode, you may remember that the main purpose of horse domestication started with milk and meat. As time progressed, many civilizations converted from the nomadic herding lifestyle to a sedentary agricultural one. Horses made a shift from food to transportation. However, horsemanship is difficult. Any equestrian will know that being able to ride a horse well takes years of training on the horse's part. You know what's easier and does not pose quite as much of a risk to life and limb? Strapping your half-feral horse to a cart that you can jump off of should trouble arise. Up until the Scythians, most major powers such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Greeks, and the Assyrians utilized chariots in their warfare. The Scythians were the ones to introduce the use of mounted cavalry into warfare, and they were good at it.
It is really funny to me that you do see the Mongols and the Huns like so prevalently, but you don't see these guys. The Assyrians were featured in Age of Empires 1, the original Rise of Rome, and the expansions that followed it. That game has now also been made into a HD edition too. But they were featured in that too, alongside, the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, etc., etc. But interesting to me that the Scythians never made it in as their own in Age of Empires 2. They featured in the game every now and again. They were obviously very notably an enemy of the Huns in one of the campaigns, but at the same time, obviously, the game is more about fun, not about accuracy, and obviously likes to stretch some truths here and there, which is what most games do. But at the same time, still think it would have been cool to have them as an option. And one of their defeated empires are from the previous game too. So,
yeah, I wonder why they wouldn't be included. I guess
you would think that they would. Yeah, they are. The Huns and the Mongols are two separate ones in Age of Empires 2. So they both have. Yeah.
I guess part of it is just like the Mongols, at least, I'm pretty sure they were like a middle age civilization, right?
Yeah, I believe so. It's so funny too because in Age of Empires 2, the Mongols had a unique technology called nomads. And obviously, like a few of them have it. Yeah, a few of them have it. So
where you don't need houses, right?
Yeah,
they don't cap your
yeah,
it's they don't cap your population.
It's like houses retain their population after being destroyed. Castles and town centers aren't affected by the same thing. And it doesn't apply to yurts, huts, and pavilions, despite having the same function. But you don't need houses to keep your population up after they've been built. It might only be the Mongols, but it's funny because it says down here that the Portuguese research it 25% faster. But also there's like the option to just like have a full tech tree when you go into the game and you can research everyone's stuff all the time. So it, obviously would come around. It is really interesting to me that in the redo, like in the HD version of Age of Empires 2, most of them got a bunch of new unique horse-mounted cavalry units added to the game. Things like Keshiks and steppe riders, which were really cool because instead of having foot soldiers that had the ability to do certain things, they just made it the same, but they gave it to cavalry units, so it made more sense for the actual civilization, which is really cool. And I really hate that the Scythians weren't part of them, because I remember having them mentioned all the time and being like, oh, like these sound like what they would add as DLC.
Yeah, like I could see them being added to the first one because they would be with all those kind of other like
the
kind of
Assyrians,
like
the
kind
Romans,
of
the Greeks, the Persians, that sort of stuff.
yeah. But I can see why they wouldn't be in Age of Empires 2 because that feels very much more like Middle Ages.
Yeah, definitely getting into like Byzantine era sort of stuff.
Yeah. I found it very interesting when I was like reading up on how like I never knew that like chariots and carts came before riding horses.
Yeah, that's really crazy.
But then I was like, I guess it kind of makes sense because like they did that with a bunch of other animals as well. Like they were like, like donkeys were kind of beasts of burden first. Oxen, nobody rode oxen, but they would use them to pull things. But yeah, it was like, I mean, part of it sounds like there is the great possibility that it was just a little bit easier. Not saying that like training a horse to drive is like easier than training a horse to be ridden, because I'm sure like I've never trained a horse to drive other than like ground driving with Ace a little bit, but it was like he already knew pressure on either side of his face on his halter would mean, so he already knew what to do kind of. But like part of the point that was made in one of the books was that like with driving a horse, once you've got one trained, you can kind of just put a young one next to the trained horse and they'll learn from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a little easier than having to like individually train every single horse, like because sure people probably did just like ride horses casually, but for like military and for warfare, chariots were what were used because you can have one person driving, the other person can be fighting, and then you get the speed that horses provide. But obviously there are the downsides, which is that like chariots can only travel over like certain landscapes. You have to build roads.
Yeah, exactly. They can't just go onto any terrain that you want them to. And I mean, I suppose they can, but they won't do very well.
Yeah. And they're like big and kind of clunky compared to just like an individual horse as far as maneuverability.
Yeah. Like, I wonder if it had anything to do with the fact that they just assumed that if they went in directly on horseback, that people would die easier from things like falling off due to inexperience or, not being stable because saddles and stirrups and stuff. And also because they were probably very expensive, like horses as a commodity, like having them and keeping them and losing one was probably a big thing, which is funny because like I feel like a chariot would, put them at risk more than just being on their back and like directly with them. But at the same time, yeah, it would be interesting to know like what made them think let's tie it to a chariot instead of just riding it. But I have to assume it had something to do with the fact that they thought it would be unstable or, it wouldn't be as safe as being on a chariot.
Or just the whole, like, trying to control a horse at the same time as trying to,
Yeah.
like, fight. And, like, these different civilizations, all the ones I mentioned that had chariots, they tended to be more sedentary and more agricultural and had like cities where they're spending all their time, and so they're tending to like protect their cities and whatnot with their militaries. They're not just always traveling from place to place. I think that likely had something to do with it. And I think just when you think of it like that, so the Scythians, and I'll get more into their lifestyle in a little bit, but they lived alongside their horses. Like the horses were like as much part of their community almost as they were. I mean, and so it's very different. Like it would be natural for them to train to ride a horse and to have your horse so well trained that you can just control them with your like pressure from your legs. You wouldn't need reins or that sort of thing. Versus someone who, their day to day is completely separate from just like training with the chariots or whatnot. So I think that was a big thing.
Yeah.
Like the Scythians lived and breathed horses.
Yeah. So it was like, why? Yeah, and obviously, the skill of being able to ride them had probably so much to do with it, and the fact that they were better than others at it, and they, had the ability to actually, do that sort of thing where they can just pay less attention and do whatever they want, and their horses would follow them and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Although I can only imagine that it was more painful to lose one for them.
The Greeks are known for being some of the most fascinated by the Scythians. Herodotus, a Greek scholar, wrote an entire book on the Scythians. While some of what he wrote has been confirmed by archaeology, we can also assume that he embellished the legend of the Scythians. The Greeks were terrified of the Scythians for their ability in battle, but they also viewed them as brutish, impotent, and stupid. This is despite the Greeks employing Scythian riders as mounted police for crowd control and offering tribute to Scythian tribes for safety. It is likely that the Amazons of Greek legend were actually Scythians. This is due to the fact that women of all ages could be warriors within Scythian culture. Scythian burial sites unearthed within the Pontic steppe region have produced bodies of women ranging from teens to mid-40s, buried in warrior regalia and surrounded by horse sacrifices. These women also have signs of injury congruent with battle. It is believed that a woman could choose to marry if she liked, in which case she would spend most of her time in their movable yurt home. However, a woman could choose to remain living as a fighter and never settle down. Sometimes, when the time arose, even married women would take up their bows once more. One myth that the Greeks spread regarding the Amazons was that they burnt their right breast to help with firing a bow. There is no sign that the Scythians engaged in such a practice. Perhaps the Greeks felt the need to embellish, or maybe they needed something to set the Scythian women apart from their own.
100%. Greeks are absolutely known for embellishing stories and making shit up randomly because they can. And honestly, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest, especially with some of the stories of their gods. Like, if you read any of the stories that they came up with, like the real stories that they came up with their gods about what they did. And I mean, like, everyone knows about Zeus and, how horny on Maine he was all the time. And things like that. It does not surprise me in the slightest, and I would 100% believe that they just made that up out of nowhere, because why not?
Or just like kind of what I was saying, if they needed to set the Scythian women apart from their own, it's like,
yeah,
we can't have our own women thinking that like they could just run off and be warriors.
And like to a point, Spartan women were kind of held in a bit of a higher regard, but still, like, they had their place as like mothers and keepers and stuff, and it was the same sort of thing.
One thing that this is like a total side note. One thing that kind of annoyed me is that I do check like Wikipedia and stuff for like, if I'm like, oh shit, I forget this one date. Like, let me just see if Wikipedia has it.
Yeah.
And in the Scythian Wikipedia, it says that they had like a patriarchal culture where women had a like traditional role in the house and barely left their homes.
That's really funny.
I was like, where did you get that?
Damn. Did you guys read anything?
I know. I and yeah, so I'm like I'm wondering if I mean considering that my main reference is a book that was published this year. I'm like I wonder how new some of these like
Discoveries
burial
are.
mounds, yeah, like these discoveries from the like burial sites are.
Mm.
Because they've found quite a few women now who were like unequivocally warriors. Like it wasn't just like, oh, they dressed them up nice. For some reason, this woman's dressed as a warrior but never fought. It's like, no, they had wounds from battle. They were buried with their horses that they rode in battle. And they had like tattoos that were very similar to the tattoos that like warriors would have, the men would have. So
They were putting tally marks on their biceps for every man they got.
there is like this interesting there's like an image of it's showing like all the tattoos they found on this one body because there were some frozen Scythian bodies and then they also did mummify some of their dead.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is like the reason it lasted so well is that like there's permafrost and whatnot when you get pretty far up north.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, it preserved the bodies really well. And so there's like preserved skin with like tattoos that they can like kind of identify. And they're mostly like animals. But this one tattoo is interesting. It's like along his back and it's like dots. And they're like, well, it resembles maybe like acupuncture or something that he got. But I also wonder, I'm like, imagine if that's just like his body count.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The Scythian culture relied on horses for more than simply warfare. Scythians drank mare's milk, a slightly fermented beverage called kumis or arag. This drink today is still a staple to the diets of people in the Central and East Asia steppes. Mare's milk carries protein, fat, and vitamins, making it highly nutritious. It is, however, high in lactose, and humans are lactose intolerant by default. Being able to drink milk without excessive gas is actually a mutation.
Yes. And it's also, if I'm not wrong, it's also more common for people from Asia and surrounding regions also to be more lactose intolerant than other people, or at least in like Central Asia, it's more common for them to be lactose intolerant than others because dairy is not as big as it is in Western culture.
I think it's like specifically, I feel like you could almost think of it more of like people of European descent are more lactose tolerant
Yeah,
because of the mutations.
yeah.
Um,
Because I know
however,
that in India they also had like kefir, which is a
Mhm.
similar sort of thing to like kumis. And I know that that's still really, really common and really good too.
Yeah, now I'm like, I want to try this.
Yeah.
I'm really curious what it would taste like. The fermentation of the mare's milk is to break down the lactose, making the drink digestible for humans. Like I said, mare's milk is high in lactose. It's much higher than like cow's milk. And so you kind of need the fermentation.
Yeah, for sure.
Even the fermentation process seemed to be made for horseback riders. The constant jostling of a bag of milk tied to a saddle was necessary for churning the liquid into a creamy, slightly alcoholic form. Another way they described fermenting the milk, getting it prepared, they could just set it in large bags, like on top of their yurt, and then they turn it from time to time. And then something that they like, I've briefly read a little bit about, I don't know how it works, was something, and now I gotta look it up again. Yeah, freeze distillation. So it's a process that enriches a solution by partially freezing it and removing the frozen material.
Mm.
I guess essentially it's just like they freeze it and then you remove the ice part. So I guess that's like
Yeah.
the water.
Yeah, and then I suppose it just makes
And
it more and more concentrated by keeping the water
yeah,
out.
yeah. And especially since alcohol like freezes at a lower temperature, and so the water might freeze, but not necessarily the alcohol. And so if they wanted to make it more alcoholic, they would freeze distill it. Like it's just interesting to me that like they knew how to do this. Like they figured that out.
Yeah.
Scythians did not only prefer mares for their milk, but also as mounts in battle. Scythian horses also varied in size and shape, likely because Scythians were worldly traders that valued any good horse they came across. This meant that some Scythian horses were short, hardy, and versatile, such as the Mongolian breed of horse we find today. They likely resembled either Mongolian horses or Przewalski's horses. Others were the now extinct Turkoman horse, a long-legged breed known for speed and endurance. Just like the breed that descended from the Turkoman, the Akolteke, these horses possessed a shimmering quality to their coat and were called golden horses.
Also cool to note that while being quite similar to the Arabian outside of height, and I suppose because they had a similar sort of body, obviously, the Arabians have their heads, which are totally different, but the Arabian had a much more broad foot for traipsing across the desert and getting through, while the Turkmen had quite a narrow foot for traipsing through rocky paths and terrain that was much more commonly found in the steppes, which is really cool.
That is cool. I'm like really bummed that this breed is extinct.
It's devastating that in Red Dead 2 they exist as a breed and they are pretty cool. And they have one of those golden coats like they'd have in real life. But yeah, they do not exist. I think if you wanted to get something close to them these days, obviously like the Akolteki is the closest you'll get. But I think breeds like the Mawari and stuff are also quite similar to them in certain ways in terms of that like noodly body. That's
I
like
think
no
they
other way I
have.
can describe it.
I think that's another like descendant breed.
Yeah, it would make sense. Obviously, I missed the memo on the curly ears and why they do that. Other than it's adorable. I don't know if Turkmen had slightly curly, like inwards curly ears. I doubt that they did.
I've never
But
seen anything saying they do. But
yeah, exactly. But it does make them adorable. So
And it's like anywhere outside of like the specific region in the world where you'll find Akoltekes, it's like gonna be really hard to find them anywhere else.
yeah,
And so that saddens me too.
yeah. Like unless you're finding the Eurasian ones, or I know that there's a lot of breeders in Russia that also breed them, especially the ones closer to Kazakhstan in like Siberia.
Yeah.
There's a really cool website of a Russian breeder that sells Akoltekis, and some of their horses look unbelievable. Like genuinely, like when I saw them, I thought they'd either been photoshopped or they were AI or something like that. But they are real, very real, and super cool. Just a really awesome breed, and that sort of. I've heard people say that the reason that their coat shines the way that it does is because the hair follicles are hollow and it makes the light reflect off them in a certain way that makes them have that shimmer to them. I don't know how true that is in science, but that's what I've been told over the years about why their coat shines the way that it does and looks quite ethereal in certain lights.
I've heard of that as well. But yeah, I don't know how true that is. Since in the horse world, people will just say stuff and you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
sure, I bet that's right. And then later you're like, I've been lied to.
Yeah, people love spreading misinformation and making things up because they can.
Or then like things that sound wildly made up actually like are having some like scientific
Yeah.
backing. I don't want to get like too into it, but like when my first like instructor was like, see these whorls on the hair on this horse's forehead, like this you can tell something based on their personality, and I was like, that's fake. Like, what are you talking
Yeah.
about? And then
Some
like
people will say things
apparently
so confidently and it's like, dude.
and then
this isn't
apparently there
true.
have been some studies that are pointing towards like they actually can kind of be a predictor, um because of like it's I don't know, because of how they form in the womb, and I'm just like, what?
Yeah.
Like
It's crazy.
no. but but yeah. The Scythians are credited as the inventors of the saddle. Slightly different from modern saddles, they did not have any stirrups and were made mostly out of layered fur and hides. They did possess a simple tree, which is a rigid part that gives saddles their structure. The tree allows for two things. It redistributes a rider's weight across the horse's back to prevent damage to the spine, and it provides more stability to a rider in combat. Scythians also utilized bits and bridles. However, it should be noted that Scythian bits were simple. A majority of the time, a mounted archer would control their horse with their legs and their seat, not with their reins. This lends to one of the most famous moves that the Scythians developed, which was called the Parthian shot. Now, you may have seen pictures of this before, or drawings at the very least, and it's that classic pose of the horse galloping in one direction, and the rider is twisted around to be facing behind them, and they are shooting from a bow and arrow behind them.
Also, the name of a weapon in Destiny 2, just for all our nerds out there, which I think is hilarious. Most people in that game have no idea what that means.
Amazing.
But I do. I don't even play Destiny, but yeah, I know that's a thing. It's also the name of an achievement you can get in the original in Age of Empires, the Definitive Edition. I don't know. Oh, it's for training 500 horse archers. I unlocked it on May 12th, 2021, if you were interested.
Amazing.
Specifically at 3:45 a.m. in the morning. I was probably in Germany at the time, but anyway. So that time was probably different. But anyway, yes, it does have the icon of the achievement is the rider doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's very funny.
The name later on kind of got like bastardized into parting shot. That phrase.
Oh, yeah.
And it's because, essentially it was something they would do as they were retreating. They would retreat, and then they'd all shoot over their shoulders, essentially, back towards the enemy. Now, that was often the weapon of choice for Scythians in military combat. They would use their bows and arrows from a distance, and then also as they came closer upon whoever they're fighting. And then once they were close enough, they would often use axes or sometimes short swords. They are probably not the first ones to invent scalping, but it sounds like they popularized it. Yeah. I don't know what it is about being like a horse riding group, but apparently that means like scalping's gonna be a thing.
Yeah. I think it might have had a lot to do with the fact that they usually carried them as trophies, like strings of scalps were trophies, and they were a great way to show your enemies how scary you were. So, and it worked. Like no one's gonna say it didn't work.
Scary.
Yeah, I mean, if a massive buff woman rode up to me on a scary horse and had a line of scalps behind her, I'd be saying, "Yep, no worries, whatever you say, I'll do it."
The Greeks said, so we take it with a grain of salt. It could be true, but the Greeks said that they would take these scalps and they'd bring it to their leader, and that's how they proved how many kills they got in a battle. And so that kind of what they would essentially do is that since they lived in tribes and not necessarily just like one big civilization with like a centralized ruler, they would often like go out on these in these like war parties essentially. Yeah. And they would plunder and they'd bring everything back, and then their leader would divvy out the spoils to everybody based on like how well they did in the battle.
And you've got to be able to show you killed a lot of people with your trophy line.
Another thing that they developed were called pitted arrows. And I mean, looking at pictures of it, I'm not like completely sure what the difference is. Other than the fact that they're apparently much more difficult to pull out once they've entered your body. Like I think they kind of have barbs on the back.
Yeah, they might have had reverse barbs that made it hard to rip them out, or if they were going to rip them out, they were going to cause a lot of damage on the way out.
Yeah, basically. And again, the Greeks claim this is that they poisoned their arrows. Not sure if that's true or not. I
Were
feel
they
like
poisoning the arrows? Were the Greek doctors just not really cutting it?
that's my thing. I'm like, at that point in time, someone's just gonna get an infection and
Yeah, I was
die.
gonna say it was gonna get in like 9 times out of 10 it was gonna get infected anyway. So
And they're like, oh, they poisoned it.
yeah,
So, creating these arrowheads, the Scythians were actually quite talented in metal
metallurgy.
metallurgy. You always just like destroy me by saying the word as though it's the most obvious pronunciation in the
No,
world.
it's just because like every game that I've played has had someone say these words at some point, and like that's how I've learnt to like get around it. Like,
Meanwhile, it's like I've read so many of these words, never like had to say them
yeah,
out loud.
and like I was one of those kids that like really struggled with pronunciation sometimes, and like even last year when I was like obsessed with reading, like I was talking about earlier, like I would, if I didn't know what a word was or I didn't know how to say it or something, I would immediately Google it and be like, how do I say this properly? And that comes from like a bunch of years of like being the kid that said epitome instead of epitome, like. And
Yeah.
I was like, never again. So when I don't know, I just look it up.
So the fact that Scythians had painted arrows and knew how to make them kind of lends into the idea that they were talented in metallurgy. And often they were found in burial sites with lots of gold and lots of other metals, basically. They were able to basically work with metal, which I find pretty interesting because I always thought of it as in needing like a solid place to be.
Mm,
I always pictured it as needing to happen inside of a building, but I
yeah.
guess their tools were mobile enough that they could just kind of go on their way, and then when they set up camp, they go on their
Yeah, I
metallurgy.
suppose it's difficult to sort of think about like a mobile crucible or something that's like
Hmm.
supposed to be very heavy and very difficult to sort of work around to, because obviously getting something up to temperature like that without an indoor facility or something that's like very built in would be really
Hmm.
difficult. But it reminds me a lot of the vaqueros, who, a lot of the time their clothing would be tattered and ragged, but their saddle and their bits and their bridles would all be adorned with like silver and gold. And like that was what they did because it meant more to them to have good looking tack and flashy looking tack and
Blinged
bits for
out
their
horse.
horse and a blinged out horse, yeah, rather than themselves having that bling instead, which is it reminds me a lot of them.
They also had a lot of rare, like gemstones, precious metals, and stuff. And this kind of speaks a little bit more to the fact that they were very well traveled.
Mm.
I mean, they were nomadic. They, for a long time, controlled a really wide swath of land that essentially connected Europe with Asia. They would have like Asian artifacts, and then they would have like European artifacts.
Best of both worlds.
Another thing about the Scythians that really didn't help their reputation as barbarians was the fact that they liked to party. For one, they would drink undiluted wine, which to us sounds pretty normal, I think, but to the Greeks, that was barbarous. They,
Heresy.
yeah, like the Greeks, they drank diluted wine, and that's kind of why they could just like drink wine all day.
All day, yeah.
And there's even like writings where they are straight up saying they're like, we're civilized folk and we drink our diluted wine. I guess part of it was that you weren't supposed to get like drunk right away.
Yeah.
And I think the Scythians, they wanted to party. They're
They said, no, we're here to get drunk. That is the point.
yes. The Scythians were also big into cannabis. My bullet point here says they partook in the devil's lettuce.
It kind of checks out for that region though, because I know that like things like kratom and stuff like that were also big around the region at the time, and using those sorts of things, especially for spiritual reasons and whatnot,
Mhm.
was like a big thing too. So that checks out by far.
And
Also, good for
apparently,
them.
yeah, yeah. Like apparently the way they would do it, or at least the most popular way, is that they would basically hotbox a yurt.
That
Um,
is genius though.
yeah, so they'd have their yurt, and then they'd have a bunch of coals, and they'd take the cannabis seeds, and seed heads, and they'd throw them onto the fire, and then they'd breathe in that smoke.
That's such a way better way than like passing around like
Yeah.
a little joint for everyone.
Yeah.
I can
And
only imagine that it wouldn't have been very easy to do that sort of stuff with the way that cannabis was back in those days, because these days we've cultivated the plant to be a majority flower because it's the easiest way to harvest it and use it for its intended purpose. But back then it was much more what like Australians call it bushweed, which is it's very leafy. The flower heads are very small, but you make do with what you have.
Yeah,
Because it's very cheap and very easy to create. So
that's a good point, because it's like they weren't agricultural.
no, yeah.
So like I don't know whether they were like finding it in the wild or if they were trading for it. They probably traded for it.
Most likely, yeah. Or like found it when they were like ransacking places or just,
Eventually, the Scythians burned out for a variety of reasons, partially due to various leaders being killed, as well as the fact that, again, they weren't just one centralized civilization. They were a bunch of different tribes kind of working in tandem. And so they never really just had one centralized leadership. And so it was kind of easier for enemies to pick them apart one by one, picking off different tribes.
For all of the Game of Thrones nerds out there, it rings back a lot to how the Carls worked for the Dothraki tribes, because every tribe had a Carl, and then those Carls would come together in the big horse city that they have. Like, I think it's a sort of like big thing to sort of relate it to, because you can see where they've taken, like for the Dothraki in particular, you can see where they've taken inspiration from the Huns and the Mongols, but I can definitely see how they've taken stuff from the Scythians. Obviously, you can tell that it's not the Scythians one for one because it's a patriarchal society. But the women, there are women in that role who are like the ex-widows of Carls that hold a very revered spot. Now, they don't have as much power as they think they do, but you can definitely see where they've taken the inspiration from, in that sort of like nomadic people that move around, and once their leaders get lopped off, and that tribe then has to either determine a new leader or fall apart at the seams and return back to like the main area. But I mean, the Scythians never had like a main civilization spot, so it's obviously very different, but I can definitely see where they've taken a lot of their inspiration from them.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I figured at some point you had mentioned them.
Yeah.
Because absolutely, the Scythians, they definitely played a pretty major role in the inspiration for the Dothraki.
Especially with like the sickle blades, like the khopesh. I think a lot of people assumed that Scythians had those, or like, I think when people, like, one of the common mistakes that people make is when they think of Scythians, they think of scythes, maybe,
Yeah.
and people having curved blades and whatnot. And I think like the khopesh, like, they were definitely around at the time, but the Scythians weren't the ones that made them like big and bold. Like the Persians were using them from the start. So obviously, like, great blade from Horseback, because the whole point is that it's easy to duck down with them and make a swing, and the blade is on the inside of the curve rather than the outside for that obvious reason. But yeah, no, I when I was a kid, I just assumed that, like, when I heard about Scythians and I was playing Age of Empires, like, I was like, oh, they must all have scythes. Like,
yeah, or like scimitars is what I think of, and it's like,
yeah, it's like, oh, not
like,
quite.
no, it was arrows mainly, and then those axes,
which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Like, it would be easy and light to use something that was a majority made of wood with like just a head on it, that was made of metal instead of an entire metal sword or something like that.
And like, all you gotta do is ride fast at someone and whack them in the head. Like,
yeah, exactly. And if you hit them, that's game over. Like,
yeah.
Good luck to the guy on the ground.
When the demigod adventurer Hercules was driving cattle through what later became known as Scythia, which is the Pontic-Caspian steppe, his horses went missing. While searching a cave, he found them in the possession of an echidna. Not the little monotreme found in Australia. Echidnas in Greek mythology are these creatures that have the upper portion of a woman and the lower portion of a snake. She promised that she would return the horses upon his completing one simple request, that Hercules sleep with her. And
I mean, it's a Greek mythology. It was always going to be about someone sleeping with someone. Let's be real.
And Hercules was like, anything for my horses.
Yes, of course he was.
Either that or he was like, girl, I was already down. You didn't need to steal my horses. He consented, and somehow this one act produced 3 sons. And then she was like, what should I do with them? And Hercules handed her a bow and a belt. And he said, when they come of age, whichever son can string and draw the bow and wear the belt should be raised, while the other 2 should be banished. Which, like, harsh. So the youngest son, Scythians, fulfilled the prophecy and became the founder of the Scythians. All of the kings of Scythia are said to be descended from Scythes, son of Hercules. Ultimately, the Scythians were far more than just fearsome warriors. They were innovators who transformed the way humans interacted with the horse and, by extension, the battlefield. They were the first true masters of mounted cavalry, a development that would influence civilizations for centuries to come. Their unique lifestyle, built around the horse, shaped everything from their economy to their culture, and their legacy lives on in the very way we think about horseback riding. While the Greeks may have viewed them as brutish, the Scythians were anything but. They were highly skilled, resourceful, and adaptable, traits that allowed them to thrive on the open grassland of the steppe. Their nomadic yet highly organized society allowed them to outlast more sedentary, less mobile empires. The Scythians may have faded from history, but their influence can still be felt in the cultures and peoples that followed them. So next time you think about the Amazons of legend, don't forget to look back to the very real and very influential Scythians.
Thanks for listening to History from Horseback. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving a rating or a review. As a new upcoming podcast, we rely on your feedback to grow and improve. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you out on the trail.